Welcome to the Movie Revolution Deep Dive Talk. Today I talk with Jonathan Sadler, who is a 25-year veteran in the film marketing and distribution business. So we just talk all things distribution and marketing, and specifically aligned with indie producers and how they can think about distribution and marketing. Jonathan also has a brand new book out called Film Marketing and Distribution, An Independent Filmmaker's Guide. There'll be a link below in the description, so please check out Jonathan's book. I imagine you're going to get a whole lot of amazing information and resources out of it. I learned so much from this talk. I'm looking forward to reading his whole book, and I hope you all get as much information and joy out of this conversation as I do. All right, so here we go. So, Jonathan, it's really great to talk to you, and I'm super happy you're here. The reason I wanted to speak with you is, and kind of dive into your experiences because you have this long resume and history of working in the development, in the distribution and marketing side of film, and a lot of times I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that people focus on and think about distribution and marketing at the end of the film,
Yeah.
and they should be thinking about it in development. Am I kind of correct in that assumption that most people do think it in this sort of almost too late in a way, and they should be really thinking about it as early as possible? What would you, I mean, is that something you see a lot, or what's your kind of experience in that area?
I mean, that's absolutely my experience. I think when you speak to people about film marketing distribution and marketing in particular, people say, oh, that's trailers and posters, isn't it? That's what you do once you've made your film and your poster and your trailer, maybe a bit of advertising. And that's what people kind of think film marketing is. But I think what's interesting about the book that I've just written is one of my central themes of the book is that marketing is really like product development that you'd get in other industries. So outside of the creative industries, if you're going to create a product for a market, whether that's a service or a digital product or a physical product, you go through this entire process in advance of like what's the gap in the market, what's the consumer need, and how can I create a product that fits into that market and fulfills that need. But it has to fit into that market in a sort of from a point of view of a critical path and logistics, supply chain. You've got to think about, who your audience is, what their budget is every month for this kind of product, whether that's baked beans or movies, what's the average basket spend. You'll test the branding, you'll test the colors, you'll test the taste, and then eventually you'll bring that product to market with all of those things in mind. Whereas when people make a film, it's almost like none of that is taken into consideration whatsoever, none of it. And it's like, I've just got to make this film and I've got this idea for a script and I'm just going to, and then people often they somehow by hook or by crook get the money, they make the film, and then they go, great. And then they speak to a distributor and they're like, well, do you realize that there's seven other films with the same title? Oh, I didn't really think about that. Yeah, so that's going to affect your discoverability online, your search engine optimization. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a thought. Yeah. And what genre is the, oh, we made a drama because we wanted, we had this great idea. You do realize the dramas are incredibly difficult to sell, don't you? And no, I didn't really know that. We just wanted to make this particular story, tell this particular tale. And and who did you cast? Well, we just went with a load of unknowns, because they were great. We thought they'd be great for the part. You do realize that people generally need some kind of sort of social proof, when they're going to invest their time in something. And oh, we didn't really consider. So all of those things, whether it's genre, title, cast, budget, especially because so many films get made that are too expensive to ever make their money back based on where that product fits in the market. And I've used this analogy before. Whereas if you were going to make a mid-range SUV for a family market and you make it so that you have to sell it for $65,000 instead of 40,000, suddenly you're priced out of that market range. So that you can't sell that product anymore. So it's really complex, and there are so many different things that go into how something works downstream, and all of those things are and potentially an obstacle or a problem down the line if you don't align those things at the very beginning. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because so many people get quite offended when you talk about films being, commerce, or people have that, they hate that word content, and they wince when you say it. It's like, oh, you can't say that, it's not content. And I'm thinking, well, content is actually quite a useful catch-all phrase for documentary, narrative feature, short film. Otherwise, you'd have to stipulate, each one in turn every time you said. So kind of like, just get over it. It's content. If you want to make something that makes money, you want to be able to make another film. You want investors to get their money back. You have a responsibility to those people. If it's all your own money and you want to make, an expressionist film in your back garden, that's totally fine. That's how, who am I to say you shouldn't do that? But if you want to make your money back, you want to make your investors' money back, you want to have meaningful distribution, then you really need to think about these things in terms of like marketing planning and in the sense of product development. One thing people have to realize as well is that nobody is sitting waiting at home waiting for you to make your film. Nobody really cares. So the whole point of marketing is making people want to see the film and care. That's the key. And thinking about all those things in advance is really going to help you have a career in film and have sustainability, be able to come back and, do bigger and better things next time. But it's mad how little it's thought of.
So, yeah, I want to kind of jump off of three things, I guess, there before I even go to even the next questions because there's so many interesting things. But I this isn't really quite. It's just I do love. I like to use that analogy and kind of what you brought there is that you're developing a product. I like to think of each film as like a tech startup. I mean, you're creating in essence, or any kind of small business, you're creating in essence a product that you're going to sell. You have staff, you'll have infrastructure, you'll even have brick and mortar, and then you create this thing and you have to sell it. So from the beginning, you've got to be knowing how you're going to possibly sell that thing. So I like that the analogy of product development there. And something else was really interesting, and had never really thought about it until you just said it. And you're talking about, especially that analogy of the cars and like an SUV, and you make it for whatever, if you make something more high end, you got to sell it for a higher price. But film doesn't work that way. You are still selling it in essence for the same amount of money, no matter how premium the product is. And that's so interesting. So like, just because you spend more money, it may make the product better, but you can't sell it in essence for more. You can't say, I had this A-list cast, so now we're going to sell tickets for $25 a piece, as opposed to, a little horror film and we're going to sell tickets for $5 a piece. So you're still selling for the same amount of money. So, so with that, you have to make sure that the budget lines up with what you think the right audience you can get there. And I really enjoyed that analogy. So a question though, I was pulling from, I was thinking about that. So I'm a producer and I say, okay, well, this sounds great, but I'm in the development stage and I'm trying to raise money. So I don't even have money to hire someone like you or to hire a distributor or a marketer to even think about these things. And I think that's probably a roadblock a lot of indie producers stumble into. So what do you say to that? Someone's like, look, I'm in the stage to raise money. I can't even spend money. I'm not even making money. So I can't even spend money yet on development or marketing. So even if they're saying, yeah, I get what you're saying, I should do that early, but I don't have the budget even to do that. So is there a way for a distributor or a marketer or anyone, or to come in kind of early on and just in essence help build a package or consult or something, and then with the idea that you would hire them later on? Or what's that process there for people who are sort of in that early stage?
I think there's actually loads of resources out there. You're a resource. There's loads of other guys out there that I follow online. There's a guy called Stephen Follows. You aware of him? He's got an incredible database website with tons of information. There's, I've just written this book. That's a relatively small investment. Like $20 or something. So I think it's just about educating yourself. You don't necessarily need to hire loads of people and bring people on board. Because I think there's a lot of things you can do yourself if you take the time to educate yourself. Understanding the process is important. Understanding the fact that you even have to think of those things is important. I mean, I struggle with titles all the time. I have a lot of people come to me and they're sort of married to a title, and I get it. Once you're stuck on something, it's really difficult to change it. I mean, I've recently developed a film myself. I'm about 2 years down the line on it, and I recently went into a co-production situation, and my co-producer says, "I think your title sucks." I'm like thinking, "You think my title sucks? I do this for a living." But then I kind of thought about it. I thought, well, actually, my title doesn't answer my own rules. And I got married to a title that probably doesn't work. I thought it was cool. I liked it, but I understand that it's not saying a lot. It's a one-word title. So yeah, kind of like you can get really waylaid as a creative really easily. And I understand that because I come from a distribution background, but I'm also a writer. I adapted my script myself from a play on its second draft, and I recently wrote a novel. So I see myself as a creator. So I have total empathy, and I feel aligned with creative people and the way they think. But I also have this commercial distribution background, so I understand that side of it as well, and I understand how easy it is to sort of not trust that advice because you're so wedded creatively to something personally. But unfortunately, you've got to break eggs to make omelets, and taking advice from people is really important because I think that's where things often go wrong and get derailed because you're not taking the advice from people. And I mean, you can get bad advice, but generally, if more than one or two people are telling you the same thing, then that's normally just time for you to sort of sit back and listen. But yeah, but to answer your question, you don't have to necessarily pay people. There's loads of resources out there. You just have to do a bit of digging, and I think once you understand the process, it's a lot easier. And it's free to set up, social media pages for your film. It's free to invite your friends to like it, to encourage them to share it with their friends. And if you start all those things really, really super early, 2 or 3 years down the line, by the time your film's finished and made, you might have 300 or 400 Instagram followers, to build upon and pan that over to a sales agent or a distributor to take over. So I often think about things. If only I'd started doing that 3 years ago. If I'd only started doing push-ups and sit-ups 3 years ago, I'd have a six-pack now, but I never did. It's a bit like that with this, just start those things day in, day out, and eventually 3 years down, you realize you've built something. But it's just people just don't start. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Yeah, and back to what you're talking about at the beginning, it's just, and then when they're starting, it's almost like they're starting too, I mean, obviously it's starting, but at some point you have to do it, but almost it's too late because the film is done and it's made and you're like, okay, well, I got to figure out how to sell this thing. And, and you hadn't started when you should have started. And then with that regard, so okay, you're starting, and I like this little workout analogy. We can kind of go with that. When you're starting working out, you don't try to go to the gym and do everything, for 3, 4, 5 hours a day. You pick something like I'm gonna do some push-ups. So what would you say someone starting early in that process is that kind of the important that we can focus on, let's say the marketing side. Let's say they don't know how they're going to distribute their film yet. They don't know exactly where it's going to go, who it's going to go through. But there are things, like you said, you can kind of start thinking about even planning on marketing and even setting those things up early. What are a couple of things that on smaller budgets, that an indie filmmaker could do to help kind of move that needle a little bit that could almost compound 6 months later? Or whenever it is that that the film is going to finally be released. Is there a couple of things that you would say this is what you should really focus on if you're going to kind of do some marketing yourself, if you have a smaller budget, before you bring in, let's say, a marketing team? Is there anything that kind of really helps move that needle a little bit?
I think a lot of it can be the choice of film you're trying to make. So if you want to stand out and you want to create something that's immediately going to have some resonance with an audience, is if you just write a drama script that completely off scratch is not based on anything that exists in the world, you're going to have the hardest journey of all. But if you like write a script about a real life serial killer or something that's happened in like there was a film called The Enfield Poltergeist, which was based on a kind of a local legend about a poltergeist haunting, you're immediately going to get interested, and then you can start with like local news. You can tell the local paper you're going to write a film about something that happened. So you're building it from like that first push up, or you might want to take something that's in the public domain, like a Shakespeare play, and do a twist on it. And immediately you've got a bit of a leg up already. People, oh, that's interesting. Like the guy I know in the industry, he rang me this week and said, I've got this project I'd like to talk to you about. And sometimes you kind of roll your eyes internally a bit because you think, oh, another conversation about someone with an idea that's going to be an uphill struggle. And immediately he said, well, I've optioned this kind of short story about the making of a really popular cult movie, and immediately think, oh my God, that's gold because there's a built-in audience for that thing already. I know I can start. I'm getting excited just thinking about how that could build, and actors like playing real people, so you're going to get much more traction from casting. They can be far less interested in what you're going to be paying them than thinking, I want to play that character who was in that cult movie. And so a lot of it can be about the clever choices you make about your film and what it is. But if you're going to be sort of belligerent and say, no, I just want to write, this kind of art movie and then expect everyone just to sort of be like, oh, please show us your film. You've got to accept that that's going to be a difficult journey. So I think going back to my original point, the marketing is all kind of in the DNA of the project itself. And I think that like Saltburn's a really good example of that as a movie, because that was so ingrained with shareable content and icky moments and things that work brilliantly on TikTok, things that you can splice up and turn into verticals and get interest in. And so yeah, so I think that creating something really compelling as a project, even before it's a script, is part of that process. Those are things that are free, or finding a local legend or a story that already has some kind of resonance. There's no other sort of easy tricks, for cheap marketing, but engage having an engaging proposition in the first place is probably the most important one. And I'd say the second one is just writing an incredibly good script, because good films tend to work, tend to sell if something's that great. But the truth is a lot of films just aren't that great that get made. A lot of independent films are okay, they're watchable, but is that enough? And do you deserve an audience? Are you owed an audience? There's no entitlement here, you have to earn that completely. It's a competitive world and it's dog eat dog, and you've got to come with something that's just so compelling people can't say no.
I really like that. And one of the things you said there that I thought was really interesting is that when you mentioned that, you come with a story that even an actor can say, oh yeah, that's a character can really see myself playing. That's something I really like. And that made me think, like, if you can get an actor to feel that way, then chances are you can get your audience to feel the same way. Like, so if someone is so interested in that character that, like, I have to play, like, there's 1,000 offers that could come my way, and that's the part I really want to play. That is so interesting, intriguing. Chances are an audience will feel the same thing, feel the same way when they see the good marketing. Like, oh, that's a character we haven't seen, or that's a really interesting story, concept, whatever. And so I like that, to because I mean, obviously, no one looks at their script and thinks this is a piece of garbage, I'm going to make it. Everyone obviously thinks whatever story they have, it's great, and everyone, and that's a whole different conversation. We don't have to dive into all that.
Some stories are just kind of subjective and personal, aren't they? And
Yeah,
others
yeah,
are
yeah.
others are made for, obviously made for an audience. And I think that's the key.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, uh, and I don't even know if this is a question we should dive into, but I mean, that's one of the things, and I know you kind of touched on it earlier too. Is that one of the things I see? It's just like, I'm not I'm making the films I want to make, and then I'll see if I can find an audience for it. Because you said, it's like, is it a film an audience wants to see? And like you said, if you're financing this yourself and you're doing it in your garage, you're doing whatever, by all means. But the moment you bring in other people's money, you have a responsibility to them, almost like a sign of respect to say, like, I'm making something with your money that I'm passionate about, but I know that people will see it. So yeah, I think that was some really, really good stuff there. And something, okay, and then you've had experience both on the indie side and on the studio side,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you see on the studio side of what you've done that is still relatable and relatable to the indie side. Like these are some tactics we used and they still work even at this small level. Sometimes, you're not buying subway billboards, underground billboards and things like that, if you're a small indie filmmaker, but there are things that still were done at that studio level that can be done and should be done, or at least are useful at that kind of in indie low budget level.
Yeah, I think when it comes to indie low budget level, then you're really kind of talking about publicity and promotions and sort of stunts and newsworthy things. And the things that a studio film will do are can be replicated by an independent release, especially if you have some talent involved in your film and you lean into your talent um, in terms of getting interviews lined up, whether it's local radio, national radio, if you're really lucky, national TV, print media, utilizing cast who have social media following. All these things are relatively well cost effective or even free. Getting talent to amplify the message across their own platforms, turning up to Q&As, all that stuff, anything that's like earned media, that studios will rely on those tactics as much as anyone else. They can just back it up with all that above the line stuff. Advertising is a really interesting area because, obviously a big movie that has going to get, big return can afford to spend a certain amount of money on paid ads. But when you drill that down, to a small independent film that might be playing in, a handful of cinemas, it's really difficult to sort of build any kind of, economies out of that because the cost of acquisition using paid advertising to buy a ticket, you kind of realize you're spending £15 to make six back. And that's a real problem for independent marketing is the numbers just don't really add up. So you have to lean into any kind of earned media you can get your hands on, utilizing your cast in any way possible, making an event out of any screening that you do, whether it's a panel discussion afterwards or a Q&A, involving local people. It becomes kind of like a grassroots slog, something you have to work really hard at. Because the sad truth is that paid advertising is really, really hard to see a return from when you're an independent and you're not going out on a wide release. It's a struggle, but that's the key, really. I think is leaning into all those things that you can do at relatively low cost. And I've always said that the best way of spending $5,000 is on a good publicity campaign.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the more sort of personal you can get with it, the more sort of involved you can get with your own film is a great idea. You said publicity, doing a Q&A, things like that, being there with your film actively. I think, as opposed to just kind of passive marketing, which is like you said, paid ads, things like that, as opposed to sort of like active marketing where you are involved with it and having someone there, like you said, spend 5,000 on publicity.
You need to be if your film's playing in a cinema, you need to be on the phone to those guys, a few weeks in advance saying, can I bring some flyers down? Can you do an email to the people that come regularly? Can I put some posters up in the foyer? Can I come down and talk to about the film in advance? Or if it's a platform, you can be, can I do some ads on your website where people are buying the tickets? It's like being clever about it. Fish where the fish are. Be micro. Kind of work out who are the most likely people to come to see this, and how can I engage with them at the lowest possible cost. And yeah, sometimes that stuff's labor intensive, but I think that's also part of the fun of releasing films as an independent producer. You might even have a distributor, but they won't do all that work for you. You're going to have to muscle in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%. I mean, one, I think it's just for your own good to do that, to be as much involved. And yeah, and like you said, a distributor is not gonna to do all that very nitty gritty kind of work. I mean, they have their tactics, in their kind of bigger picture. But this very like in every single cinema, make a, they're not going to call every cinema and be like, hey, make sure, can you help us make sure people see this movie? And get there. One of the things I wrote it kind of the thought came up when I with Kevin Kelly's 1,000 True Fans, and I thought about filmmaking. And when I ran the 48-hour film project a couple of years, I thought about how hard it is to get people to come to these screenings and showings. And I rented a cinema, and then I made, you make a big deal of it. An idea of the whole thing of the 48-hour film project, just kind of make an event of it. And I realized, well, indie filmmakers could think of touring their films the way that a band tours, and that you go there. I mean, you can still have, you can, wherever your film's going to screen, but you go there, like you go to your fans, to the people who want to watch it, and chances are they will show up because maybe they wouldn't show up if you're not there, but maybe they will show up, and they may even show up even if they don't even know much about your film because it's like, oh, the director of this film is going to be there. I don't even know what this film is, but this sounds interesting. I should check it out. And I think that word of mouth builds a little bit better too, because when you're sort of already actively engaged in your film in those sort of small local markets, wherever the film is, I think it helps it build up and get people more involved. And that helps that build more.
Yeah, no, I've seen it happen, and I've seen people with films that I would call a hard sell really work it, kind of going on local radio 3 days before the screening, and they were getting people to turn up to these screenings, and maybe they're two-thirds full, but I've seen, you go to most cinemas, the regional cinemas at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and there's four people in
Yeah.
there, and I've released films where I've realized, with a bit of a kind of sinking feeling that nobody came to certain shows at all, and the film was just played to this empty cinema, and that's quite scary. And then there'll be another cinema where it's completely full. There's not really any pattern to these things. If you release an independent film on 100 screens, you're going to have one cinema up here is going to take 3,000, and one cinema down is going to take £48.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So, and I've been in that situation where you do treat it like a band on tour. You have to. It's the only way you're going to get people to show up. I mean, there's say what, 20 films released a week, maybe 15 to 20, maybe even more. And if you went out on the street and you said to someone, name 3 films that are out this week, most people probably couldn't even name one, let alone all the others, let alone have time to see all the films they want to see. So it's almost like an immaculate conception when a film comes out and people turn up, because that doesn't happen by accident, that's been designed, that's a creation. And a lot of time and effort's gone into that. And obviously not every release can be like that. And you can't necessarily tour the country. It's expensive to travel and stay in hotels and that sort of expense as well. So sometimes you maybe have to keep it within a sort of, a footprint that you can afford to travel within. You just have to do as much as you can really without killing yourself.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that thing that's the biggest. It's sort of, there's a lot of grit and grind to get your film made, and you should put that same kind of passion into
Yeah,
into the
absolutely.
distribution side and the
That's the
market.
heartbreaking thing when you get every obstacle you reach is like, a hurdle you've jumped over in this race. And then sometimes you get all this way and you get a distributor, you've done everything right, you had a sales agent, you've played the festivals, and then the distributor dumps your movie right at the last minute because they got too much else on their slate or they had bad feedback. And suddenly it's a bit like a game of snakes and ladders. You reached all the way to the top of the board and suddenly
Uh,
you've got the dreaded snake and you just kind of, and some people end up in that position. And sometimes it's of no fault of their own. It's
yeah.
just the way the dice have has fallen. So yeah, it's there's no such thing as a sure thing.
No, exactly, exactly. And actually something you said there, talking about distributors and maybe they've kind of backed away from your film or things have, shifted around. It will kind of segues into the next thing that I know gets brought up a lot, and indie filmmakers are also very hesitant about distributors unless they know the name, Neon, A24, etc. Because they hear sort of horror stories and things like that. And what would you say are some, it's hard to research every distributor. It's hard to find reviews on everyone out there, right? Unless you're making phone calls with produce, like if you look at the films they released and then call the producer and be like, hey, what was your experience working with them? It's kind of difficult to do that. So what would you say, what are some red flags to kind of look for to ensure you're working with someone or company that sort of, obviously it's a business, but also has, much as their business as your film business at heart together.
I think these days there's quite a lot of resources for this kind of thing. I know that there's a Facebook group, for example, like I was ripped off by some lousy film distributor. I don't know the exact name of the
Ah,
group, but it's something like that. And
okay.
there's loads of stuff in there like don't go near this distributor.
Ah,
And I think a lot of those aggregators that were like taking money up front for people and offering them. I think a lot of those guys have died out now. I think it's probably a lot fairer system than it was maybe a few years ago. The thing about any sort of traditional distributor who's been in the business a while is they're not bad people. They're not bad guys. Sometimes things happen. They might really like a film that they screen and they decide to take it on. You might get an MG or it might be a revenue share kind of deal. But then they screen that film to exhibitors and platform buyers or whatever, and then maybe those platform gatekeepers don't like the film, or often it's the scheduling issue. We've got too many other films on this month, and scheduling is a real problem. There are, so as I said before, there's maybe 20 films released and there's only so many screens. So often it is that the reasons why the film doesn't have a successful distribution outcome isn't normally because the distributors are scheming a bunch of people. They generally want films to work, but at the same time, they're not necessarily going to spend time trying to put a square peg in a round hole. So they'll accept the fact if the feedback's bad, they'll accept it and move on. What's hard for the filmmakers to accept that and feel they haven't been kind of misled in some way, like there's some kind of agenda behind it, but generally there isn't. And you can reach out to other producers and filmmakers, through LinkedIn or you can find their details on IMDb or whatever. I don't think anyone's going to be upset that you've got in contact with them to ask their experience. I think generally people are pretty generous about sharing their experiences. People love being asked what advice, can you
yeah.
give me some advice? You've got great experience. And so I wouldn't be shy to sort of do your research but also just have your eyes open. I've worked for a few independent distributors, and I know from first-hand experience that there've been a lot of disgruntled producers that felt that they got short shrift. But oftentimes it's just the realities of the market at any given time just means that it's survival of the fittest.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that goes back to kind of what you're saying. I mean, this is kind of nice that it kind of keeps circling around itself here now, is that, you know, you put as a filmmaker, producer, whatever, you put so much effort into making the film, and then you almost become so hands off on the distribution and marketing, but get upset when things aren't turning out the way you want them to, or maybe it didn't maybe make as much money, or the distributor's not doing or the marketer's not doing what you had hoped they were doing, but you're just sitting there kind of wanting these things to happen as opposed to also as being involved or proactive as possible during that process as well. And it's nice to kind of that we keep now referring back to that it's just that, try to be as active in this process
Yeah.
as you are with making the film.
I guess it's that loss of control, isn't it? Because as a producer, all that up until that point, you've had complete control over, the outcomes, and suddenly you're handing this baby over to someone else who's like a surrogate parent, and then you don't have, you don't say, well, it's time to change its diaper, have you fed it enough milk today? It's out of your hands, and that's really tough. And I understand that. I totally empathize, but if you're a distributor and you have too much empathy, it can work against you as well. And I was always very filmmaker friendly when I was in distributors, and I was always trying to help a distributor. But sometimes, as a distributor, you have to be cruel to be kind as well. And it can end up being awkward if you're just trying to help someone out because you care about their projects, not as much as they do, maybe, but you care about it.
Yeah.
And it's probably good. It's probably a good thing as a distributor to be relatively dispassionate in that sense, because I think otherwise you'll waste a lot of time and you'll go slightly mad.
Yeah, of course, exactly. So I know a lot of times too, that there's this. perception that you release your film, it's out, and then it's kind of like, okay, that's it. Whatever happens now, and it's done. But obviously, there's a long tail there, and there are things that you've seen or that filmmakers, producers can do to sort of ensure. I mean, you're never going to see big peaks, but at least to kind of see that long tail stay above zero, for 2, 3 years even. Is there anything that can kind of help ensure that, that they can continuously see some kind of revenue over a course of, after it leaves the, let's say, the theatrical window, what can be done to kind of help ensure that it still gets some viewerships here and there?
I think one of the things people miss out on actually is the theatrical long tail. There's a lot of cinemas out there. There's a lot of film clubs and film societies. There's even a town with a couple of cinemas might have a film club that meets, in a non-traditional environment, like a civic centre or something. There's companies out there. There's a company in the UK that's part of Warner Media called Film Bank,
Hmm.
and they make sure films are played at universities and colleges and schools. And I think a lot of people just they might play, 5 or 10 cinemas, and then they think that the digital windows come upon you, which is now like maybe 31 days. And they think, well, that's cinema done now, but it isn't done. There's still loads of places that will play your film, and so many people don't think of that. Even distributors, and I worked at one distributor that was really good at milking the theatrical, even way beyond the window, because a lot of audiences don't care if it's on digital. They want to go to the cinema, and oftentimes at rep cinemas, like my local cinema, their audience tends to get the program a month in advance, and they'll read the blurb, and if the blurb talks to them, they'll go and see the film. It's a bit like walking into a bookstore and thinking, I want to read a good story today. So you read the back blurb of 5 books and you buy one of them. So these sometimes the choice of curation by the audience is being made through that, because they have a relationship with their local cinema. They think, I'd like to go to this cinema twice a month. It's part of my lifestyle. I'll be driven by the stories that resonate with me. So don't ever give up on ringing up more cinemas and getting more bookings, because don't think about the window too much. There's always going to be local cinemas. There's in Scotland, there's a bus that drives around to small communities, and people, the back doors open and there's seats inside, and it's like a kind of portable cinema. There are so many different places that play films. So you just have to think, I'm going to exhaust every single possible opportunity to have my film played, even if it's just once for one night in a theatre. There's a filmmaker I know who made 3 films pretty much back to back. He wrote 2 of them. All of them had cast that you and I would know immediately if we, and he didn't play a single festival, and he didn't have a single theatrical screening of any of his films, because they all went straight to a digital platform or a streamer. And I think that's really sad as a filmmaker not to have that experience, not to go to talk about your film at multiple film festivals, and not to enjoy seeing the film on a big screen with an audience. There's always a way, if you can work the phones and hustle, there's always a way that you can get your film played. So that's one thing that I'd just like to stress that, because people just seem to assume that once they've had a few screenings, that's it. But it doesn't matter that it's going on digital, immediately thereafter. And then that then transpires with, obviously there's so many more channels now. In terms of long tail, there's AVOD, there's fast channels. I've seen films get picked up by Netflix as part of a catalog deal 3 years down the line, and suddenly it's in the top 10 on Netflix, because it's suddenly just, I mean, that's rare,
Yeah.
but it can happen. You can get a second life. And I've even known films that have gone past their 15 years with a distributor, been picked up by a new distributor, and they've got the film relisted on Apple Store or something, and maybe one of the actors in that film suddenly made a new film, and suddenly they're hot again. And so you never know when something might come back, and you might, like, it's like having a lottery ticket you find in the drawer that you haven't cashed in. Sometimes that can happen, and you can't plan for that kind of thing, and you can't, that thing, it either happens or it doesn't. But once you've made a film, there's no end to that process. If you're with a distributor, yeah, that maybe your hands are tied to what they'll do with it, but rights do revert. Maybe don't sell your film for too long a period so you can get it back quicker. Yeah, there's always a second life, and the long tail is just so key. But as I say, I would just stress that don't give up on cinema as being a long tail potential, because I've seen films, this distributor I work for, maybe like their opening weekend figures ended up being like 15% of the entire run, whereas a lot of films these days it can be 50%. Because the film's only playing for 2 weeks. And the bulk of the audience was front loaded.
Yeah. Wow. There's a couple things I wanted to just go. There's two different directions. So one, I want to circle back to this because some things we talked about in long tail, and I was just thinking about emerging trends and different things an audience can do during different parts. And I don't know, I made a few different notes here. So I want to get to that in a second. But then you mentioned festivals, and we actually hadn't talked about that. And I think it's a kind of a good thing to touch on because this is that conversation. You can see it between Reddit, you can see it between on Facebook, and submit to festivals, don't submit to festivals. I mean, we obviously know those tier one festivals, and a lot of and those are very, very, very hard to get into. And so let's look outside of that kind of tier one, the top tier festivals. What is your What's your thought on festivals? Like, when should a filmmaker think, like, yeah, I do want to try to take the festival route beforehand, and this is why you should think about that because you have this kind of film or XYZ, or say like, don't worry about the festivals with that if you have this kind of film because this is what you should be focusing on. So when do you suggest or how do you suggest that kind of festival strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I can't ever see why there's a good reason not to play a festival. The only time is that some festivals will only play a film if they get it first.
Yeah, yeah,
So you might go for a lesser festival and then you screw yourself for getting in a bigger festival. So I think you have to have like a priority list and you have to go through it kind of in a linear fashion. So for example, if you want to play Fright Fest in the UK or Glasgow or Dublin, those festivals might not follow each other. So you can kind of choose the one you want to go for rather than just this blanket apply for everything. And then if you get rejected from those, then go to your second tier. It's a bit like kind of looking for a literary agent or something. You don't want to like send your book to everyone in the first instance. You want to pick the ones you like and then move down your list. But I can't think of a good reason not to play a festival. But there are some festivals that kind of exist as a kind of cost center in themselves. So their business model is we're a business because we make money for people submitting.
yeah,
And that's a bit cynical. And those festivals can not be particularly helpful. I mean, loads of festivals won't help you in terms of getting a sales agent or a distributor or critics reviews. But at the same time, even if you play your film to 12 people and you talk about it, that's still an enjoyable
yeah.
experience that's
That's
rewarding.
good. Yeah,
Yeah, so I can't see any reason why you wouldn't do that, as a filmmaker, because the whole reason you've made this film is to share it with an audience, and an audience of two is better than an audience of no, isn't it? So I can't see any reason as long as you go out with your eyes open. One of the things I do see is that a lot of people take this kind of thing of like validation through festivals as being valuable. And if you see a kind of poster for an independent film, it's got 40 laurels on it,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
you're kind of thinking, oh my God, this just looks horrendous already. This just looks like, this is just this a festival film and it can kind of pigeonhole it into sort of being something that's just for people who like go to
Yeah.
festivals, kind of weirdos or whatever. So that kind of validation is people can believe that it has more value than it does. And I think, I've been sent screenplays that people have sent me and said this has won a screenplay award at
Yeah.
Worcester or
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
a screenplay award in Birmingham or whatever, and you kind of read the script and you think, my God, the script it's dreadful. How could it have won? And you kind of think, well, some of these things are kind of like everyone goes home with a prize kind of thing, you know, but people then believe that they've got something better than it is, and that kind of feedback's really unhelpful, I think.
Yeah.
You build up this confirmation bias that you've got something a lot better than it is. And then, I had experience recently where I gave feedback on someone's script and, and they took offense to the fact that I pointed out what was wrong with it because they'd won awards and stuff. And that kind of backfired on me quite, in that scenario. So yeah, kind of getting honest feedback is something that is really important outside of that whole kind of festival thing because it is a means to an end to some people. Yeah, it's their business.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, those are some interesting things to touch on there. I mean, I'm a big supporter of festivals too, but like you said, not all festivals are created equal, and there's the top tier, and then I think people then group almost everything else together. If you go to like Film Freeway right now and just kind of look at all festivals, there's a little over 14,000 listed. If you just, I just did this because I was just doing some research. And if you just click, you can do the slider from like 1 year to 20-year plus festivals and go all the way to 1 year. There's over 4,000, there's over 400 films listed as just a first year festival. So, yeah, I can imagine that if you apply to all of those, no matter what you had, chances are you're going to get in because they're a first year festival, and you have a higher chance of maybe even winning something because, again, it's a first year festival. And there's nothing wrong with, being a part of those festivals and doing those things, but taking that and being like, well, now I had this great look. I won best, film at brand new tiny festival, tiny town. It's cool that you did it, and I do support film festivals, and I think it's great. But you have to be careful with the way you sort of promote that. I think, like you said, it's nice to get people to see it, and it's nice to be in the room when people are seeing your film to see how they respond and react to it, but also know how you are treating the festival and what your goal is with it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess people have this envision I'm gonna open at Sundance or I'm gonna
Yeah.
open at Fantastic Fest and then they end up opening at Romford, in East London or yeah, it's just but it is what it is. It's not like you can necessarily choose what festivals you're gonna play. They
Yeah,
choose
yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's like a lot of these things is that you can't necessarily choose your sales agent, your distributor, or your festival. That you have to kind of work with the offers you're getting. Um, the power isn't genuinely in the filmmaker's hands.
Yeah. I will step away from the festival thing in just a second, but then you said something else that I just want to tap into once more there too, add to it. People want to get into Sundance. They want to do those things. I mean, I forgot who just posted it recently on LinkedIn, probably someone that worked at Sundance, and they said they had 15,000 submissions, and they only have 150 selections. But that's 100 and not 150 feature films. That's 150 from, short film and documentary and feature and everything. So you're talking about 1%, and the features are probably, 0.25% of that. So the likelihood of getting into one of those top tier festivals is very slim. And I know that some filmmakers can see it as like, but that is their distribution strategy. And then that's what they're banking on, relying on. And so do you think then with that you should see festivals like, okay, have your distribution strategy, but right before you do that, you can do the festival run. And if it works, great. Now that even amplifies this. But if it doesn't work, now you still have that kind of plan A. It's almost like plan A with an asterisk. Does that make sense? Is that how you would think about it, or is there a way to think about it if you really are adamant about trying to use festivals to help with um, grow that the distribution and marketing of the film?
Yeah, I think yeah, you have plan A, plan B, plan C, and but it's still a plan. You know, you got to shoot for because if you can get into one of those prestige festivals, then it's a game changer potentially, isn't it? It's suddenly a shop window, and also it's that endorsement you get. There's a lot of people who are artists, but the one that's endorsed by the industry is the one that's going to be taken notice of. So yeah, you got to aim for those things, and then if you're not getting in, you've got to think, right, okay, well that's out of the way. What's plan B? What's my next best option?
Yeah. And plan B should already be planned out even beforehand.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. That was great. I'm glad we kind of dove in that festival thing there. I know that there's a lot of people who are always curious about, thoughts on festivals. And from your perspective, that's fantastic.
I
So,
guess if there's a fee involved in submitting to festivals, then
yeah,
you should
yeah,
budget the yeah, because if you're going to apply to 14,000 festivals and they're all $100 each to
yeah,
enter.
exactly. And then also, I mean, what good is it if you get accepted to 50 festivals and you have no budget to go to any of them? You
Exactly.
can't fly there and stay in I mean, some festivals I know there's very not many, but will help support your hotel or help support something. But most of them you have to kind of pay your own way.
If it's a major festival, like in the UK, for example, if it's London, Dublin, or Glasgow, they're going to pay for you to come
Yep.
over and put you up in a hotel, and maybe one other person if you're lucky. But what they also do is they'll work with other festivals to share talent travel.
Yeah.
So if someone's going to Gothenburg, after Dublin, they'll pool resources. And yeah, and it's tough. And as an independent distributor, I remember I had, when I was working with Vertigo releasing in 2023, we had 7 films in London Film Festival, and it was hugely expensive. So you had to rely on the festivals to sort of kind of contribute, at least contribute to travel and accommodation. Yeah, but you're right. If you apply for all those amounts of festivals and you get in, then yeah, you've got to kind of work out how you're going to fund all that. And it's your own time as well. You can't be doing
Yeah.
other things when you're doing that. So yeah, there's a lot of things to consider. But yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Fantastic. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think I mean, there's a lot that could be just that someone could dive in there and then and kind of figure out their strategies. So okay, I want to go back to a bit on the long tail, but something to talk about emerging trends and things that filmmakers could possibly do to help with so many things have happened. Had thought about this conversation from the beginning, and now this question from the beginning, but now this conversation has kind of helped me see it in all kinds of different lights. So you talked about verticals and for Saltburn and how that was, TikTok and exploded. And there's great little pieces and clips from that film that obviously work very well for social media. And it made me think about that as, I mean, verticals is a huge is trend now. And I don't mean, and I want to talk about sort of vertical film making, but you have your feature film, but you say, okay, I want to get it out there amongst people who are watching verticals. I saw someone, I forgot who it was, but they referred to YouTube shorts and things like that as like trick-or-treaters coming to your house for Halloween. You're giving out a little bit of candy. Some of them may want to come back later for a meal, but right now you're just kind of passing out a little bit of candy. You're getting them a little excited. So verticals for a film. I'm assuming that would be such an interesting way to obviously see that long tail, but that's probably something you can use, these different trends you can use during production or right at post-production before release, during release, and then even during that second life to help give it a second life. Because you mentioned the second life of the film, almost like tapping into creating your film as like a micro zeitgeist. Sort of Saltburn tapped into a wider zeitgeist, but so what do you think about some emerging trends like verticals and when to use them to help promote your film? And should it be done through that whole kind of process from post-production all the way 8 months after theatrical?
Well, I know that now a lot of the streamers are, because I worked with Amazon on a film a couple of years ago, and they were kind of they came on board and put some money into the film because they were going to get it after its theatrical window, and they brought people on set to specifically create social content, all vertically filmed, cast shout outs, cast doing funny things, in audition footage, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so people now on set are building that into, the call sheet. After you've done this thing, you're coming to this studio to do a load of socials. I think that the film, the Rose is one of the most recent films. I saw that they'd obviously done a lot of Benedict Cumberbatch and Olivia Colman have done a lot of specific filming for social media, and they'd obviously done a specific photo shoot for the poster because they recreated the Last Supper on the landscape formats. Um, so that kind of marketing thinking was built into production, and that's happening more and more all the time. And there's absolutely no reason why an independent filmmaker doesn't do that because you're in total control. For years, actors have been sitting playing solitaire in their trailers when they could have been filming themselves doing a video diary or blog or look at my costume and look at having my makeup done and all that stuff's content. And it's very easy to capture and you can capture it with lo-fi. You can film it on iPhones.
Yeah. And it's free.
It's free. And so there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't do that. And in my book, I've got a chapter on all the assets you can, capture on set, that are going to help you down the line and be a film, but understanding that things are now vertical, which is kind of counterintuitive, obviously, because a cinema screen is like the opposite, but it is what it is. That's
Yeah,
the whole thing about UX design is it's sometimes it's counterintuitive to the native format of the thing, which is just an odd. And these days, obviously, you have to build subtitles into everything because generally people are watching things in mute. So there's just a lot of things to consider, and that's probably where you do need to get professional advice, or a consultant on board because those things are easy to get wrong, if you don't, do them properly, have them set up properly.
exactly. Yeah, I love that. I love that you have a chapter about assets in your book. Yeah, if we can,
The early chapters, yeah, it's pretty key.
yeah, I would actually let's dive into the book here for a little bit before we kind of can sign off. What so first of all, what is the title of your book? Who's it for? And then also, who is it for and what can they get out of it? Okay, film marketing distribution.
Yeah, it's an independent filmmaker's guide. So
Nice.
this is written for independent filmmakers. It's not written for people who kind of already work in marketing and for distributors. It's really kind of all those things we're talking about today, all the things that you can understand about, paid advertising and how tough that is. There's loads of, as I said before, there's loads of great resources out there. There's loads of great people out there, yourself included. There's a few other guys I follow on LinkedIn who give great advice as well. But yeah, it's aimed at independent filmmakers who really kind of need to understand all these things, so they stop making mistakes that hurt them, at the end of the day. I mean, I was speaking to an aggregator the other day and saying, because the bottom's fallen out of the TVOD market a bit, especially here in the UK. I'm not so up to date with other territories, but part of the problem now is that the aggregators, sorry, the platforms have become mini aggregators for each other. So whereas before you'd have to have an Apple subscription to watch an Apple show, and you'd have to have a Sky subscription to watch, now they're sharing each other's content. So it's a bit like having loads of stores in the high street that are all now selling the same brands in their shop window. Whereas before you could go to one and get this product, and then you could go to that one to get this product. They're all got the top products now in the window. So all the second or third tier products are now below the fold. So whereas you used to, you'd get on, have exclusivity on one platform, now it's all pretty much for muchness. And you can see a Paramount Plus show on Apple, and you can,
Yeah.
see the Sky show on Amazon or whatever. So it's become really hard. And it's he was saying that someone might make a film for like $150,000 or they might bootstrap that, they might borrow it from their parents, put it on a credit card, and then they go to their aggregator. They say, well, what are my month one sales figures? And they say, well, you made like 400 quid. What do you mean I made 400 quid? It was 1,500 quid to upload the assets to the platforms. And it's just the reality of the market now. People are the model's changing. People are, you know, it's all about cheap subscriptions or fast or AVODs. People, watching adverts in films again, which is really, to me, that's really regressive. I spent my whole life looking forward to not being able to watch ads, in the middle of my movies. But if that's what you can afford, you know, with the cost of living crisis as it is, especially here in the UK, I don't know what it's like in Sweden, but people's wallets are pinched. So if that's how they're gonna get their content, that's how they're gonna get their content. But yeah, it can be a real eye opener when you kind of realize that the paid for transactional model is super tough. So it is about budgeting effectively, understanding the market, and playing long tail for all you can. And along the way, just thinking of all the marketing hooks you possibly can that you can build in to make, to have a plan, have a strategy. I'm looking at distributing my first film as a distributor, as an independent. I've been wanting to do it for a while, waiting for the right opportunity, and I'm thinking, God, this is it seems to me I always seem to come at these things at the worst possible moment in history, of trying to do things when it's suddenly the hardest it's ever been. So you think, well, if it's that hard, then I've got to have a plan that's gonna, the plan might not work, but at least it's a plan, it's a strategy. It's I'm not just throwing it out there and then going to get a horrible surprise when you realize that how poorly things can perform, if you're not prepared for it. I went to a course a while back when I was a distributor. It was called the Business of Film, and it was a kind of like an ongoing course. And the tutor there, he said something to me that always stuck with me. He was saying, whenever you're planning your finances, do an exercise where you double your costs and halve your expected revenue, and then look at what you're ending up with. And it's funny, because then I've released so many films that's happened where you've had this forecast and you've come in way below your forecast and you've ended up spending far more than you planned to. And then there's that disconnect on either side. And that can be pretty scary and sobering when that happens. But everyone should play that game. You know, you you play with this often low, medium, high figures that you get from a sales agent. But then there's another low that's off the chart below that. And maybe there's another high that's off the
Yeah,
chart the other
yeah,
way. And those two things might be rare, but
yeah.
both those scenarios can happen. So you've got to think what happens if literally this tanks, and nobody shows up.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, everyone looks at that, like you said, they have the low, medium, high, and then they always like look at that little outlier that's, way up there on the high end, but no one ever really thinks about that little outlier on the way low end.
I think, well, I won't get the low and I won't do the high, but we'll get the medium
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
it's kind of guaranteed.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
but the truth is anything can happen, and you've got to be prepared for that. And I guess you've got to be able to survive that loss if that does happen.
Yeah.
That can't break you. Don't put the house on it.
Yeah, exactly. I want to leave with one little thing here. So you said something which is kind of perfect for this last question I want to ask you. You said right now, you distribute your own film, and you said it's the hardest it's ever been. And that's kind of perfect for this question because you have 2.5 years, 2.5 decades of experience in this. What do you think is going to happen in the next 10 years? I mean, is it going to be, will, will there be a new balance of distribution? I mean, it's the hardest it's ever been now. Will it just continually to get harder and you just have to keep adapting to that? Or do you see some kind of balance or reckoning or, and you don't have to kind of go into this big grandiose picture, but just kind of like, if you see one little linear thing, you think I can see how this will change or that will change.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's like an ecosystem, and an ecosystem has layers. It can't just be
Yeah.
Netflix can't just do everything. They can't, there's always going to be a demand for film. Feature films are like a bite-sized evening, aren't they? A long form series is something that you can digest. But a movie is like a fast food meal, isn't it? You kind of digest it in one sitting, and then the next night you maybe want to watch another movie. So there's always going to be this demand for movies, and the streams can't fund all those movies. So independent films have to exist as part of that ecosystem. But if there isn't a transactional model and there isn't revenue to be made, how's that going to work? So I guess then it comes down to, public funding, government subsidies. There needs to be more investment in the arts. People need to be given more grants. Um, need to give me more opportunities. A lot of people criticize the BFI in the UK for only championing sort of social realist kitchen sink dramas that aren't necessarily that appealing to mass audiences. There's this thing is why can't we make romantic comedy with that money? And so there's a lot of arguments about, and I think these plates need to shift a bit. There needs to be opportunities for people that want to make commercial movies that entertain people. It can't always just be about social commentary. And so I think, the ecosystem needs a bit of a reset. Um, People want films, people need films, independent filmmakers deserve an opportunity to tell their stories. But if the model is too tough, then something has to give, doesn't it? Somewhere down the line. And the streamers it's not, they've got their own challenges. The era of PTV's over and budgets are being cut. Trump wants to bring all the production back into the US, and yeah, so it's always an interesting time to it's always an interesting debate in the industry, and I guess it's always been changing, hasn't it? But maybe it feels like it's changing more rapidly now than ever before. And you know, option
Yeah, yeah.
dries up and another option. One of the things I was talking to a distributor in my book, and he was saying that actually it's not a bad thing in the moment because there are more places now to sell your movie to than ever before. You know, there's more opportunities. It's like I was saying before, you just have to work them all a bit
Yeah.
harder.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, no one's coming to save you, so you've got to figure it out. And a lot of it that also means just it's a lot more work, a lot more research, a lot more work, a lot more conversations and emails because like you said, yeah, there's a lot more places to distribute your film. There's a lot of revenue, a lot of avenues to find revenue. But that also means there's a lot more work to
Yeah,
filter through those
so as a
places.
filmmaker, you need to now you really need to understand the market and how your work might fit into it. You can't, there isn't any leeway now for just making a movie and hoping that it can work. I guess the answer to the question here is you have to have a distribution strategy and marketing strategy, and you have to budget for that accordingly right from the very beginning. And like I was saying, I think that those decisions about your title, your genre, I think those things are kind of marketing decisions, but they're not traditionally thought of as marketing decisions, and that's really goes to the heart of what my book's about.
Fantastic. Jonathan, this was amazing. I learned so much. I'm so happy with this
I
conversation.
wasn't sure you were going to learn anything from me at all, but I'm glad to hear that you have learned something.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate it. So thank you so much for being here and part of this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure and a privilege.